What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the You Know Ball podcast. I am your host, Troll Bro Dude, and making his second appearance on the podcast today, we have Derek Bodner from the Daily Six News.
Sorry, I think I have a little bit of background noise. Let me see if I can get rid of that here. All right, I think we should be good to go. I apologize about that. In all seriousness, I give Keith a lot of credit. I've always respected people who go to the front line of dangerous situations and bring us the information that we need to know. So props to Keith. And quite frankly, he didn't even miss a beat when he was doing that with all that going around it.
Yeah, the beat writer that we need on the front lines just dishing out takes.
No, I will almost guarantee Keith is trying to do a pod post-game in the Wells Fargo Center.
100%.
And Rich and I have tried to do that in the past. And with the way they deconstruct that arena after a game, there is legitimately not a quiet room in that entire building. Like, we have had nights where we have tried to do a post-game pod. We went from one room to another to a third, and we just said, you know what, screw it. Like, we'll do a podcast tomorrow and move on with life because this is impossible. So give Keith, like, as much as I'm trying to maybe entertain myself, because I know the rest of this podcast is not going to be entertaining. I empathize with Keith because it is quite literally impossible to do a podcast in there. And if you have to crank out a post-game pod.
Well, especially after the Sixers shoot 5 of 20, and then that
could have been their pregame shooting lineup drills. You don't know.
That's right. They were going back out there, and they were just keeping up the trend from that night. But you know, it is funny. I reached out to you.
Also, if you don't get that reference, go to Trill's Twitter timeline.
Yes. I think everyone who listens to the podcast has probably seen the clip at this point.
There's a reason I make that joke on your podcast, not on Sixers Beat. Yes.
Yes. So when I reached out to you 2 days ago, I said, hey, I need someone rational that doesn't have reactionary fan brain to come onto the podcast and kind of talk me off the ledge a little bit.
That was before the Spurs game. Yes. I don't know if I have a measured take after losing to the Spurs, who are garbage. They are a terrible, terrible basketball team. And the Sixers had no chance of defending them. It was wild.
So that was before the Spurs game, which we both assumed they were going to win, obviously.
Yep.
If you think about the context of the situation, it's even more insane because going into last night, I was just like, they got this in the bag. I'm not worried about this game. Even it was kind of a no-win situation. Because if you win the game, you're like, yeah, it's the Spurs. Like, you should win. And if you lose the game, it's a disaster. And and everyone starts pointing fingers and PJ Tucker screaming in the locker room.
Nobody was going to feel better about the team after that game last night. But at the very least, like before the season, which feels like a year and a half ago now, and my takes feel ridiculous. But before the season, I picked them to win 56 games. That at least felt like that was one of the 56. That was all you could accomplish last night. That's the only thing you would have come away from it with. But you don't even get that. You just get pretty much pure panic, which I guess.
Yes, and you also have the fact that, like, once again, the context of the situation, the Spurs were on the second half of a back-to-back.
Yeah, against a team that should have been desperate and annoyed at themselves, and they came out with that effort. Yeah.
And I'm trying to not go insane watching this team. I'm trying to keep my positive outlook that I had preseason, which is exactly what you just said. Like, I said I could see them winning 55 games easily. I thought it was going to end up somewhere in that 55, not upwards of 60. I think the league's just too good now to win 60 games. But to start 0-3 with a loss in Boston, that's understandable. Boston's always been a bad matchup for them. You know, I think they are a uniquely hard matchup for the Sixers with their athleticism. They have continuity from last year, plus they're bringing in more depth with Malcolm Brogdon coming off the bench. I understood that even though Robert Williams was out, I felt like that was going to be a tough game for the Sixers no matter what. They were in the game for most of the game. It was really the third quarter where it kind of got out of hand. So I could excuse that. And, you know, look, you're not going to, and one of the reasons why right now, if you're listening on audio, you can't see my thing is Fire Doc Rivers, but my whole thing has been through the first two games.
You editorializing, not me, because it sounds different coming from me.
It is my personal opinion. It does not reflect Bodner's opinion at this time. But I just want to say, like, through two games, I was like, how could you possibly look at this situation and say Doc should be the guy that needs to go when Joel Embiid is playing as poorly as he is? Like, if Giannis plays as poorly as Embiid does through 2 games, the Bucks are probably not winning. Right. If the best player on the team is playing extremely poorly on both ends, you're not going to win a ton of games, regardless of whoever your coach is or the co-stars or whatever. So through 2 games, I was kind of like, Joel Embiid's been terrible, and that's kind of what I chalked this up to. I think that they could have easily won either of those games if he wasn't absolutely miserable. And then last night happens. So where are you at in terms of, like, 1, how do they right the ship? And 2, is Doc on the hot seat?
Yeah. I guess we'll start off with Doc. I wouldn't say he's on the hot seat, but Daryl certainly does have a history where he is not unwilling to make a change early on in the season. You know, Kevin McHale was fired, I think it was 11 games into the season. They were something along the lines of 4 and 7. So there's certainly a precedent for that, especially when you factor in that Daryl didn't make the hire. There's a lot of expectations. James Harden didn't take a pay cut to come in here and win 45 games. So I'm not saying it's completely unfair, but I don't think we're at that point yet. Especially when there is sort of like a built-in excuse, 2 excuses really, which is the newness of the components, which I don't 100% buy because quite frankly, a lot of them have played with James Harden in the past anyway. Mm-hmm. There is a little bit of a learning curve playing with the post-up center. There's really only 2 of them in the NBA. Not many people have played with that style of offense. So I think there's a little bit of understanding there. But also the fact that Joel Embiid does not, outside of that 40 spot against the Spurs, does not look like himself. And we obviously found out on Friday that he had plantar fasciitis in the offseason and wasn't able to do much of anything basketball related in the final 2 months leading up to training camp. He certainly played like that in the first 2 games. And Joel Embiid has always been sort of like the player where if he's not doing basketball drills, he's not in his best shape. He's not in a flow. He has no rhythm to his game. So I think there is, knock on wood, assuming, and plantar fasciitis is a tough one which amazingly we haven't had to deal too much with here in Sixers land, but is a common injury in NBA circles. And sometimes you can come back from it. Sometimes that can linger and, you know, flare up later on down the line. It's basically inflammation in the foot, in her plantar fascia. That can go many different ways, and we don't know which way it'll go. And if we're hearing reports in January of, oh, Joel Embiid can barely walk, well, that's massive. Right now, knock on wood, it seems like he is not suffering any ill effects of that. It's just a conditioning and a training leading up to training camp that is impacting his play. So I think, am I concerned long-term? Well, I think there's a couple of factors to that. The perimeter defense is concerning, wildly concerning. And that was one thing where I looked at and I said, look, this concerns me a lot in the playoffs. I think this could be one of the 2 or 3 things that could cap their playoff upside, their championship equity. I didn't expect that to show up too much in the regular season. I still expected them to be a top 6 through top 8 defensive squad. I think I picked them 6. I think I was towards the top end of my range, but maybe I was feeling optimistic that day. I don't know. But I thought they would be a very good, not quite dominant defensive team, but that backcourt and that perimeter defense would be a concern in the playoffs against teams like Boston and against teams who have a chance to really game plan and scheme against it. Well, that's showing up as a concern every night so far, including against a Spurs team which had no business dropping 114 on the Sixers. The transition defense, which has always been a problem with the Sixers, and probably always will be a problem in the Joel Embiid Sixers. Yeah. Especially with the take foul gone, you need your big man back to control that foul line area, and Joel Embiid is never back to control that foul line area, in part because of the style he plays. You know, when you're running your offense through deep post catches or big men driving to the basket, it's tough to get back, in part because he's arguing for foul calls, and in part because he's not very committed in transition defense. So those 2 things concern me a lot. And then there is just how long does it take Joel Embiid to ramp back up to what we expect Joel Embiid to be? You know, I think the game the other night against the Bucks was really telling because that was the one of the few teams that could really match him physicality wise. And when he tried to explode near the rim, he didn't seem like he had a lot of lift. He missed a wild layup. He got blocked a couple times. And the timing on the jumper and the elevation on the jumper just wasn't there. And he didn't really know how to revert back, like what to really rely upon. And look, when you booked me, you mentioned this. I was supposed to be the talk me off the ledge guy.
Oh, no.
And I think at that time, I looked at it and I said, look, James Harden, quite frankly, just looks better physically than I expected. And he had a disastrous game against the Spurs. But still, like if you go back to some of those moves he made, he was exploding out of his moves in a way that wasn't prime James Harden, but it was a half step quicker than he had at really any point in the Sixers career last year. And I think that was important. And that to me was the bigger early season indicator that mattered in May and June. I had a lot of confidence that Joel Embiid would get back into form, and that if he did that, then the early season Harden development was the bigger deal. I still think that as much as this is an incredibly frustrating start to the season and just not what I expected at all, I think if I sort of like disassociate myself from what's currently going on, I still sort of feel that way.
Yeah.
My only concern is what happens if the plantar fasciitis comes back. Right. What happens if he's just in and out of the lineup, if he's never able to get into tip-top shape, if he's feeling the effects of that even sporadically throughout the course of the season. And I don't really know how to put like a percentage chance on that, but that's really more than anything else. And the perimeter defense is the second major concern, but that to me is the overriding concern by far.
Yeah. I mean, look,
just because I have no idea how to account for it. I have no idea.
It's really hard to balance because it's exactly what Joel has talked about for 2 years now, 3 years really, which is, I know fans want me to rest. I know they want me to, everyone wants me to be careful, but if I do that, then I'm going to be out of shape when we need it the most. And you could chalk up the last few injuries that he's had in the playoffs to kind of freak bad luck stuff. The plantar fasciitis thing is more concerning because, like you said, not able to do basketball for 2 months, which we didn't even hear about until
he joked about it. Everyone thought it was a joke.
I thought it was a bit.
On the couch.
Yeah, he's like, I was just chilling.
He said it like it was a bit.
Yeah, and then he never cleared up that he was actually like, oh no, I was actually
we followed up by like, what did you mean by that? And
sure,
I'll be fine.
Yeah. Okay. All right. It feels like something that should be mentioned. I don't know when you're the best player on the team, and
he did at one point in training camp say, I wasn't able to get as much work in the offseason as I would typically hope to get. And we all thought that was because of the thumb surgery,
right?
And because of the face. We thought he was talking about the early part of the offseason when he was recovering from those. I guess we should have followed up and made sure, like, hey, there's not something we don't know about that also limited you. I thought we knew the full extent of his basketball activity limiting injuries, but I guess we didn't, and I guess that's on us.
In your guys' defense, this is mystery injuries have never happened with the Sixers before, so
yeah, that's fair.
It's always something. Like,
Joel Embiid, did anything happen to prevent you from shooting? Is that a thing that's on the table? I don't know.
Here, let's just go down every single body part. How does your head feel? How does your arm feel? It's always going to be something.
He's tough to work with in that regard too, because he doesn't really want to admit, at least initially, he doesn't want to admit because he's very cognizant of that injury-prone Mr. Glass reputation. So I think his initial instinct is to play through that, and then when he can't play through that, that's when you hear things like this come out.
Yeah, that is kind of the conversation that he's been having for a while now, which is like, he doesn't want to have the reputation of being the guy who's always injured. He wants to be able to play through injuries so he can stay in shape for the games that really matter when they get to the playoffs. He understands the load management thing, but he still wants to compete in the regular season, get the Sixers a high seed, win awards in the regular season. It's totally understandable. Now we're at the point where I totally agree. The thing that I would talk about, like when we would talk about like swing pieces in the offseason leading into this year, was like, okay, obviously James Harden, like whatever. I never even had mentioned Embiid's health because it goes without saying that if Joel Embiid is not Joel Embiid, the Sixers aren't contending for anything. So why should we even bring up that point? But now you have this. You also have the fact that I don't know. I understand getting, like you said, adjusting to a new style with the offensive center. You said there were two guys in the NBA who are like mainly post up bigs. And obviously you meant Joel Embiid and Jakob Poeltl, who is who's apparently Wilt Chamberlain. But like, I totally understand that. I honestly think you mentioned the fact that a lot of these guys have played with Harden before, which is a good point. But also in those hardened defenses, they were usually playing a switching scheme. They were usually, now they have to get used to playing with a drop center. They need to get used to, not that PJ Tucker and Daniel House and guys like that and D'Anthony Melton can't fight over screens, but it definitely is an interesting, not that Melton never really played with Harden, but like those two, it's definitely a transition, I would say, from probably what they're used to when playing with James Harden, at least. The perimeter defense is definitely the biggest issue for me. But I guess my whole thing with Doc goes back to, so I've said this for a while. Like I've kind of been like over the Doc Rivers experience since the Hawks series. Obviously, there has been a lot of things. I thought he did a good job with the team during the regular season, getting them through everything last year. I think that in the regular season, he's generally a fine coach.
Yeah,
but my biggest thing for Doc has always been the playoffs. And then on top of that is like, what does he really do? Because like when
what would you say you do here?
Literally, what would you say you do here, Doc? Like that.
There are not many times I get to make an Office Space reference on a basketball podcast, but I appreciate you laying that one up for me.
Oh yeah, no, I think that we have made this exact reference before because that's how we feel about the Doc Rivers experience. It's like, okay, so in the regular season, I can understand, he's good at motivating guys night to night. I think that he tends to coach best when he doesn't have the superstars available. He can kind of have, when Embiid was missing games last year, that last Clippers season, before they got Kawhi and Paul George, they were able to kind of, play above the level of their talent. And I think that he's done a pretty good job of that in his first 2 years when the stars are out. But my whole thing with this is like, I think about back to when we were looking at coaches to hire, and my two top guys were Ty Lue and Mike D'Antoni. And then I had Doc as my third guy. And I kind of had Ty Lue and Mike D'Antoni as the top two guys because I felt like I knew exactly what they were going to bring to the table. They're both good tacticians that have the respect of players. They have proven systems that have worked on teams. Ty Lue obviously already had the respect of LeBron James has a long history being a good assistant, coach to a championship. Mike D'Antoni has always had regular season success and a shaky playoff record, but he's had very good conference finals level teams that have over the past 15 to 20 years. With Doc, I looked at all of the talent that he had. I looked at everything that he's been able to accomplish post winning that title with the Celtics, despite having so many Hall of Famers, so many stacked rosters, and been like, he's not a great X's and O's guy. He's not like, I guess his big thing has been that motivating thing, like when guys really buy in their first year or two with him. But it seems like by year 3 or 4, in the Clippers case, the second time around, it was after 1 year, the wheels really started to fall off. And I understand that, like, once again, if Joel Embiid is playing as poorly as he did in the first 2 games, I can't really get mad at Doc Rivers. In the third game, when we're still having issues getting back on transition in as far as defense goes. And I agree with you that Joel presents a unique issue in terms of if you're going to play that style out of the post on offense, especially with a guy who's not in shape and needs to get back, whether he's arguing for calls or it's just the fact that he can't get all the way back. But last night, I rewatched the game this morning, and last night in that game, like the cameraman from NBC Sports was not even able to keep up with how many times the Spurs were able to get the ball back down and get a wide open 3 and hit a wide open. It happened like 4 or 5 times.
And that happened a lot in the Boston game too.
A ton in the Boston game. And my whole thing with this is, if your big thing as a coach is being the motivator guy, is being the guy that has the respect of the players, and we're just literally not hustling at all, we're not putting in the effort and the energy in order to get back on transition defense, which is a bare minimum thing, regardless of the play style of Joel Embiid, then I guess I'm just starting to question what he really does around here. Because if you've started to lose, your voice maybe isn't quite as impactful as it was in his first 2 years, and your main thing is being the motivator coach guy, then I just don't really know how you can argue for. And once again, I'm not saying they should fire Doc today. That's a little bit tongue in cheek on here saying fire Doc Rivers. But my whole just argument for it is the fact that if there's even a inkling of the fact that he might be losing the locker room, quote unquote, which is something that can happen with coaches, in that once that original message starts to fade, then I think it's something that you have to consider, because this is such an important year for the Sixers. Because I'm honestly worried that if we flame out, whether it's in the first round, second round, if the team doesn't live up to the expectations that were set for them in the preseason, that massive changes are going to be made in a very bad way.
Would you ask Pop that question?
Sorry, I've got a soundboard. I got to play with it when I'm a guest on someone's podcast.
The irony after last night of that.
Yeah. No, look, I think, first of all, I think you probably undersold his regular season success with the Clippers a little bit.
Sure.
It wasn't just the Tobias year that they overachieved. Like, they had, I think, 48 wins in something like 8 out of 9 seasons. Mid 50 wins for like 4 years in a row. They were a very good team, even though the team seemingly hated each other. They were a very good regular season team.
They also had Chris Paul, who's like the regular season GOAT.
100%. But I think generally speaking, he gets to a place where he puts his stars in pretty good spots. So I don't think it's just overachieving with a Toby-led group. I think he does a pretty good job in the regular season. My complaint with Doc Rivers has always been he's a little bit inflexible in the playoffs, takes a little too long to adjust. And some of the stuff that he leans on in the regular season isn't something that it will translate to the playoffs. And I don't think he does a good enough job of predicting that. And we can obviously go to DeAndre Jordan last year or Montrezl Harrell this year and my concerns there. But I think regular season wise, he is a good coach.
Yeah. I
share a lot of your concerns, and I agree with you that this is could be a real pivot point for the franchise. And I think they need to find success this year. Whether or not that means an in-season change, I don't know. I do think that can be we're watching it with the Phillies right now. I think that can be a huge boost for some teams, and I think that can be a huge distraction for others.
Right.
I do generally think a lot of what we're talking about here in terms of the clubhouse, in terms of players buying in, I think a lot of that comes down to, I put a lot of that on the shoulders of your stars and your most prominent voices in that locker room. I think the impact coaches have is overstated at times because they are the most visible extension of that, and because they are the most replaceable. I think there are many coaches who would just come in here and magically fix the Sixers transition defense or fix their body language or make them all love each other? No, I think there's probably a minimal impact there. But when a lot of your resume and maybe your selling points are based on that, it's certainly fair to question that. Like, would somebody come in and all of a sudden, make Joel Embiid get back in transition or fix their body language and make them a cohesive unit? Maybe not, but at least he'd be a brilliant, X's and O's tactician who can overcome some of that. So I think it's fair to question that. I'm with you that I thought the Hawks series was an abysmal failure from a coaching perspective that got overshadowed not a little bit, but a lot by the point guard who wouldn't shoot. And maybe Doc Rivers should send him a gift basket because of that, because he took a lot of attention off of his coaching failures. And that's a real concern. And right now he looks like he has no answers. As he said, they are not ready to win, which is one of the most amazing quotes I've heard come out of a coach 3 games into the season.
Amazing.
But it is where we are.
Especially,
I don't think he's wrong. I'm not sure he understood that he has a role in that.
Yes, it is literally his job to ensure that this happens. Yeah. And also, I would understand the whole integration of new players thing a little bit more if we were especially if we're playing with inexperienced talent. Yeah, I would be like,
no, go ahead. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut
you. You're good. You can go.
I was just saying, you have experienced talent who's playing roles that they're used to playing, and all of your core pieces that you're playing off of are in place from last year. And quite frankly, it's not just the Anthony Melton that doesn't look like he knows what he's doing. Tyrese Maxey right now doesn't look like he knows what he's doing on offense, which is a minor deal. Tyrese Maxey is a freaking brilliant offensive player. Yep. So yes, I agree that it's not just new players.
And some of it can be drawn back to some of the weird personnel fit. All things considered, my biggest concern coming into this season with the starting group was Tobias Harris. And I think he's played totally fine on offense. Yeah. I think that his offense has been, I believe he's shooting like something in the 40s to start the year. Obviously, that's not super sustainable. He was like 44% or something like that on a decent amount of catch and shoot attempts. He seems like he's kind of fitting into that role a little bit better. The PJ Tucker thing, taking out a volume shooter like Danny Green and putting in more of a forward who is used to, kind of being around the basket a lot. He stands in the corner, of course, but, he's setting screens. It is a little bit weird. It's a little bit clunky to have as many kind of guys that are used to being in that inside the paint and not be floating around the perimeter, kind of whether it's starting their offense, extending possessions with offensive rebounds like he's used to, and he's been able to kind of have a little bit of an impact in that regard. But it is weird when you're looking at this team, and in theory, once again, we picked them to win 55, 60 games. Like, this is a team that should be running teams off the court in the regular season. And maybe it is just a slow start. Maybe it is in the Milwaukee game, they shot terribly. In the Boston game, they defended terribly. But anytime that we go up against one of these teams that has two athletic wings, it seems like a nightmare, an absolute nightmare that could prove to be a little bit hard to fix throughout the course of a regular season when you're playing this personnel. But I just keep going back to the fact that, I think some of Doc's inflexibility as a playoff coach can also extend to the regular season when he has the certain personnel that he has. Montrezl Harrell, who is a guy that I was actually if you watch my reaction video when they signed Montrezl Harrell, my thing was
never go back and watch old pods. You never go back and listen to old pods. Never.
I went back and I watched it because I feel a little bit vindicated in my take in that I was saying, I think Montrezl Harrell is a fine regular season player. I think on a lot of teams, he makes sense as a backup center, teams that are starved for shot creation and just having a little bit of dynamic offensive talent that you can bring off the bench. My big concern is the fact that the coach was literally fired for playing Montrezl Harrell too much in a playoff series. And I didn't think that these issues would extend to the regular season. But last night watching the game, I rewatched it against a Spurs team that had no business being in this game. And I'm just watching Montrezl Harrell on each end and just, once again, what do you do? What is your role here? I know that he's still figuring it out, but he's played with James Harden in the past. If he's not going to bring you anything on offense, we know the defense is going to be a major concern. So then really what is the role that Montrezl Harrell can play on this team? And I'm going to give him a little bit of a break because it's 3 games into the season. But at the same time, I guess my big thing has always been with Doc, once again, is if you're playing guys who are good in the regular season to help with seeding, I understand that. George Niang, Montrezl Harrell, guys who in theory might be able to contribute to winning in the regular season and provide important roles. But my whole thing with this team is even though they're 0-3, I still don't care that much about the regular season if you know that these guys are unplayable in the playoffs. There's just not a deep playoff round where Montrezl Harrell's ever going to play big minutes and be impactful. He's never going to do it. And I've been kind of up and down on Paul Reed. I was not the biggest Paul Reed guy. I thought he did a capable job despite some of the issues with his game with the fouling and all of that. I thought he did a capable job in the first round of the playoffs last year. He struggled when he was thrust into a bigger role in the Heat series, but that happens with young players. But my whole thing has been you kept Reed over Bassie. Then you sign Montrezl Harrell, a guy Doc is going to play. And I know Doc has control over 2 or 3 roster spots or whatever it is. But that he is going to play him. And the second Paul Reed struggles, he's getting yanked. And it's not going to be the case for Montrezl. So my whole thing is I want to figure out the playoff rotations now. I want to figure this out. I know it's important to win in the regular season, but it's more important to me to figure out guys who can stay on the court in the playoffs. And I just feel like I know George Niang and Montrezl Harrell cannot play deep into the playoffs. And I would rather take shots on guys who might have a little bit of playoff equity, even if you're not the biggest Paul Reed guy. From a two-way perspective, there's just no way that he's not going to be the better option than Montrezl Harrell.
Yeah. I mean, I had this conversation pretty famously with Doc in a post-game press conference last year.
Oh, the victory tour.
Well, yeah, it was that press conference. It was, no, I don't have, anyway. Yeah, look, I am like you, where I wasn't 100% bought into Paul Reed. Still not 100% bought into Paul Reed. You know, I think when he came into the draft, a lot of people questioned whether he would ever get to the point where he was a basketball decision maker that coaches would trust. And I think Doc certainly subscribes to that, or at least did last year at this point. What I was 100% bought into was that DeAndre Jordan had no chance.
Yep.
And even if maybe Paul Reed only had a 25% chance of being a capable backup center in the playoffs, that was more than DeAndre Jordan. So give it a shot. Give him some experience, get a chance to evaluate and figure out what he could do and what you could rely on. And I feel similar this year. It's different because Montrezl Harrell is a way more effective regular season player than DeAndre Jordan at this stage of his career.
Absolutely.
So like you, if you're looking to eat some minutes and win some regular season games, I think there's a role for him to play. And I can sort of hear Daryl Morey, if he's listening to this, say, why are you spending so much time talking about a 7-minute per game player? Well, I think part of it is because we still have to evaluate and develop and get Paul Reed ready, because I'm like you, I don't see any real playoff matchup. Maybe if you get like that garbage Wizards team they had in the first round a couple of years ago, maybe if you get someone like that, he could play a role in that series, sure. But any kind of semifinals, conference finals caliber team, Montrezl Harrell should not be on the floor for that. You only really have one option on.
And you don't get the Wizards in the first round anymore. Let's keep that in mind.
Yeah, sure.
Like the Eastern Conference is too good. Even if you get the 1 seed, you could get the Toronto Raptors again in the first round or the Atlanta Hawks. Yeah. Like it's just not the same Eastern Conference.
So I agree with you. Like evaluate, develop the one player who really could play in those kinds of series. Especially like this surprising one to me would be like Boston, which seemed like tailor-made to not play Trez because they're going to switch 100%. Everything. You're not going to get those pick and rolls that he lives off of. You need guys who can defend Boston's wings. And he's, to me, making decisions that are not only not meeting the long-term goal of having somebody ready to go for the playoffs, but also just game to game, some of those decisions I don't agree with either. And look, I think the one major difference this year is you have PJ Tucker, who we've already seen can function as a small ball in a lot of those same matchups where you would turn to Paul Reed. So you have sort of that in your back pocket. You probably don't need to work on it too much because Paul Reed has played that role before, because a lot of the players that are on that unit with Paul Reed PJ Tucker has played that role before. And a lot of the players you would put on that backup unit with PJ Tucker at center, Daniel House, James Harden, you've already had them play in that role before. So you sort of have that card to play in your back pocket. So maybe it's not quite as pressing as it was last year when you had maybe the worst rotation player in the league that Paul Reed was fighting for.
Yeah.
Or fighting with. But yeah, I agree with you. Like Montrez is not going, and again, it is like, this is, I think, pretty low on the list of why they've struggled here out of the gate.
Agreed.
But it is something that you project forward and you say, well, are they going to make the same mistake they made in previous years? And I share your concern. And especially some of the, like, you're seeing George Niang and, Montrezl Harrell on the court at the same time. That should never happen. You can't run that lineup out there.
Especially with the Sixers perimeter defenders. Are they playing with James Harden? And then, you want the guys, exactly. You want the guys that are out there. And like one of the things I actually said this morning is because I feel like the offense will just figure itself out. I don't think that they're going to shoot as poorly as they did in the Milwaukee game. I think that they will be able to fit, I know the rank you posted this morning, they ranked in 24th, I believe, or 26th in offensive and defensive rating, which is obviously not good, but I have faith. Obviously, it's not ideal to be in the bottom 10 or whatever, bottom 7 in offensive rating, 3 games into the season. But I just feel like with James Harden, Tyrese Maxey, Joel Embiid, and to a lesser extent, Tobias Harris, I have a really hard time seeing an offense not being at least, a top 12 offense with
that would be a huge, that would be, I think, underselling it. That would be a huge disappointment if they finished 12th. It
would be a massive failure. Yeah. I mean, there's no reason that with the offensive talent that they have that they shouldn't be a top 5 offense. It's just I picked them 3rd in my predictions. Yeah. Like there's very few teams that have the level of offensive talent, especially in the regular season, with two of the greatest offensive talents in NBA history. And James Harden's not the James Harden of old, but he's still a very effective regular season offensive player. Even the compromise version of James Harden that we got at the end of last year when he was on the court with Joel Embiid was posting like 123 offensive ratings. So that I think will figure itself out. I think those pieces will eventually fit. It's the defense, once again, as you said, I am concerned with. And one of the things that I've been thinking about here is, do you kind of just lean into, obviously you want to have a balance of offense and defense at all times, but do you kind of lean into those, I can't believe I'm the one saying this, Matisse Thybulle, who as everyone who listens to this podcast knows, I have never been a Matisse Thybulle guy. I never thought he should have started for the team. I never thought that he should have been valued in trades for the team. I've never been a Matisse guy, going back to when I started the podcast 2 years ago. But I do think that, I just feel like they need to create more transition opportunities. He's going to be able to give you that. I feel like in the regular season, you are able to get away a little bit more with his offensive limitations that he brings in the half court. And Daniel House, the new guy that they've brought in, once again, if Joel Embiid is playing as poorly as he did in those first two games, if they can't figure out a way to make the pieces fit, this doesn't matter quite as much. I'm going to stop pointing all the fingers at role players, because at a certain point, there's been one guy who's been here for 6 years. And, at the end of the day, if Joel Embiid is not the best player on the court, the Sixers aren't going very far anyway. But from a role player standpoint, if Daniel House is playing as poorly as he has in the first few games, not being able to hit a shot, I think that he's able to run actions a little bit better with James Harden. He's able to do some things that Matisse Thybulle cannot do on the offensive end. But I don't think that, even though he is a good defender, I don't think he's the level of defender that Thybulle is. And I think playing Thybulle and Reed with some of these backup units can at least create those transition opportunities, can at least make life harder for the other offense in a way that we just need guys who are going to go out there and hustle. We just need to not look so old and slow. And as flawed as those players are, they're certainly not that. So I think that could provide, having Thybulle and Reed with those backup units could provide at least a little bit of injection, because I just feel like no matter who they put out there offensively, the offense is going to figure itself out when you have stars and players that the Sixers do, and the defense is the real area of concern. And once again, maybe I'm being a little bit hypocritical here because I just said, why are we playing Montrezl Harrell? Let's play Matisse Thybulle. But at the same time, when you're talking about winning these regular season games, I would like to see a little bit of injection of chaos on the defensive end, and not just the same old thing over and over. Athletic wings and shooters absolutely gashing this team.
Yeah. And to your point so far, Cleaning the Glass, great website, estimates that 11% of the Sixers' possessions start in a transition opportunity. That is the second lowest rate in the league. They don't force turnovers. They don't get out in transition. They don't have really any athleticism outside of the occasional throw ahead pass from Harden to Maxey. That's all they have. And look, I am a lot like you in that if Matisse Thybulle is out of the rotation, I think that's Matisse Thybulle's fault. He's had a lot of time to make himself at least passable on offense. It's never really happened. I don't necessarily care what the team talks up in training camp. He's got to show it on the court. And he's had 3 years of the easiest 3-point attempts in the league. Among the easy, he doesn't take a single contested one. He doesn't take a single one off of movement. I'm not even talking JJ Redick sprinting 100 miles an hour off of a screen movement. I'm talking taking 2 steps back into the corner like PJ Tucker or Danny Green. He doesn't have that kind of movement. He doesn't shoot any off the dribble. It's purely standing on the perimeter, catch and shoot when he has 10 feet of space, and he still shoots 30% on them.
Yeah.
And if he is unplayable, it's because of his own lack of development. Coming in, though, when I looked at it, I said, I don't really want to give this guy an extension because I don't know if he's part of the rotation long term, and I don't know if I'm pretty confident unless he develops, he's not really playable in the postseason. But I didn't think he should be completely stapled to the bench either, because like you said, there are just matchups where it makes sense to get his length, matchups where it makes sense to get his ability to fight through screens, nights where you just need a little bit of energy and activity and ability to get out and break. I think he should be a part-time player.
Yeah.
But every now and then give it to him and just see if he can change the game a little bit, because this team does not force turnovers right now. They don't get out in the break. They don't have any real defense for big wings. I think Daniel House has been disappointing defensively. I think Anthony Melton has been really disappointing defensively. Good pressure defender, but has not done a good job either keeping his man in front of him or getting through screens. I do. And look, I feel put in a really weird spot here defending Matisse Thybulle or promoting for more minutes for Matisse Thybulle, because I don't really believe in him. And I share your concern that you should be playing people who you think can play in the playoffs. And I don't really know if Matisse can, but right now they just need something to change sort of the equation and the complexion of the team and give it a shot. I don't think you need to be, I think there's enough depth on this team. And look, in terms of depth, like it's not like you have a lot of high level players off the bench, but you have a lot of options to go to. Every now and then, I think you just need to try a different ingredient and see if it changes the dish. And Matisse is one of them, and Furkan might be one of them too. When you just need someone to come in there and be unconscious, and that doesn't mean I believe in Furkan. It just means that every now and then you've got to change something to see if you can get a different result. And we're only 3 games in, but I do hope that they experiment a little more than just using sort of like the 8 or so guys that so far Doc Rivers has relied on.
And I also think that there's a little bit of a wrinkle that is different with Reed and Thybulle than there is with Montrezl Harrell. And that wrinkle to me is trade value. Because if you think that the Sixers are missing something, which I think that it's pretty clear that they are missing some element of something so far to start the season. You know, we thought that the bench issues would be resolved. We thought the depth issues would be resolved. And we still don't know how many guys you can truly trust in a playoff series on this roster. Pretty much no one on the bench has a history of performing in the playoffs. The starters up and down, obviously. So if you're looking at this team and you're looking at who has the upside to potentially get you either an extra rotation piece or someone that could even potentially be a 5th starter if the PJ Tucker and Tobias Harris fit is too weird, or if you get to the deadline and some team decides to blow it up and they're like, we'll take shots on Thybulle and Reed, and also maybe we'll give you back a few rotation players and we'll be willing to take on the Tobias Harris contract. I don't think that's incredibly high, but I also think that we know with Montrezl Harrell and Daniel House, they just have no trade value around the NBA. There's no team that's sitting around talking themselves into trading for Daniel House and Montrezl Harrell and that changing their life. Thybulle and Reed, a little bit younger. You know, Reed's going into the last year of his contract. Thybulle's going into the last year of his contract. You would have the restricted rights if you want to bring them back. We know that there have been teams around the NBA that have been interested in Thybulle, and 2 teams specifically that I have been hoping have disaster seasons. So far, the Blazers look great, and unfortunately, that is not happening. The Mavericks, we'll see. I don't think that they're ever going to be bad enough to truly have a disaster season as long as they have Luka Doncic. But if they disappoint, I think that there are teams around the league that could pivot basically halfway through the season to say, let's look at our long-term window. Maybe there's a team out there that can convince themselves that they can turn Thybulle into the Danny Green type player that we've always wanted. So there is upside at least to playing those guys in the regular season. So that would be my argument against me being a hypocrite, basically, and saying, hey, let's play Thybulle, even though we know we can't play in the playoffs. But one last thing here, and this is a major thing for me, because once again, I feel like I'm beating a dead horse the last 2 or 3 podcasts. We need Joel Embiid to be Joel Embiid. That's all that matters to me. If he can get back to that level of MVP candidate, the team's going to be totally fine. Everything else will kind of figure itself out from there. The last thing that I really just want to hit on here is what do you think it would take for, like you said, you're like, I'm not sure Doc Rivers is really on the hot seat. Because the last time you came on my podcast, you said in order for the GM to really consider firing the coach, the history tells us they have to be someone under some sort of pressure from ownership, which I believe the last time you came on, it was right before the James Harden and Ben Simmons trade happened. Okay. So obviously I think that extended any sort, obviously I think sitting here we did not expect to get James Harden at the time. Those reports were not even out. But my whole thing is what would it take for Doc Rivers to truly be fired this early in the season? And if they were to theoretically move on from Doc Rivers, Do you think it is an in-house replacement, or are we listening to our guy Bill Simmons, who is convinced that they're going to hire Mike D'Antoni just out of nowhere?
Yeah, no, look, I think in terms of pressure, I still think it would be pressure on Daryl, but I don't think it would necessarily come from ownership at this time. I think it would come from if there's pressure coming from Harden or Embiid.
Right.
If one of those just get completely frustrated and say a change needs to happen or what the hell is going on, that is where the pressure would come from in this scenario. You know, I think if you start off something like 0-8 or 2-10, who knows? I would typically err towards not making changes or it being unlikely to make changes this early in the season. I don't think teams typically like that kind of, especially a contender, like that kind of overhaul. So it would take a disastrous start and then pressure coming from the most important people in your organization, which are Embiid and Harden. In terms of replacement, I think given the fact that they have both an up-and-comer in Cassell and someone who's done it before in Jaeger, I would guess it would be, if this did come to play out, it would be an internal candidate. I think that is probably, and again, I think part of that comes down to just that would be the less drastic change, the one with the less amount to get used to and accustomed to. There'd be less upheaval in that kind of a change. You'd probably see something with an interim tag, and then they would have a chance to play through that. Although not guaranteed, you could see a decision made right there. But my guess, and this is just a guess, because if you ask anyone with the team right now about a coaching change, they'll certainly deny. But my guess would be internal candidate.
Yeah.
And I think it's a pretty strong probability. Like if something did happen, I think it would be a pretty strong probability it would be internal.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I also think that it seems like in theory, at least, because of just because of the relationship with Cassell and Maxey, the fact that Cassell's interviewed for so many head coaching jobs over the past few years, didn't end up getting any, but he's been in that pool of candidates. You know, same thing with Dave Jaeger, like you said. I think their options are generally speaking better than most
typical
teams.
Team. Yep, I agree.
Like, I think the assistant coaches have been pretty fantastic in certain regards. Especially like, you know, even Dan Burke, who filled in for Doc when he was out last year. So I guess before we get out of here, I would agree with that. If there is a move, it's just so rare that you make an outside hire in the middle of the season, especially a guy like Mike D'Antoni, who, like, we know D'Antoni's been a great coach, especially in the regular season when he has the right talent. But at the same time, he's going to bring in an entire new system. He's going to implement it. And, you know, once again, I guess
sort of like the wild card in that prediction or that scenario is, does Embiid and or Harden go, we want Mike, get us Mike,
right?
Like if that happens, I guess that could change the equation, but I still lean towards internal quite heavily.
I don't subscribe to the theory that Bill Simmons has been pushing, which is like basically just
Embiid going to New York.
Well, it's not even the Embiid going to New York thing, because I actually don't think it's insane that if the Sixers underperform, that Embiid could ask out after the season. Like, at a certain point, this is just what stars do in the NBA. Except for Damian Lillard, the large history of this shows that if you're not getting past the second round into the conference finals and competing for championships, your star player is going to ask out. Just kind of how it is. Like, you know, I don't think it's the craziest thing in the world. Now, what
is Daryl Morey's Twitter bio say? Opportunity is not a lengthy visitor, something like that. I think that applies to the NBA.
Exactly. And I do think it's funny that the thing that we were poking fun at is the obsession with agents, which is obviously a very important thing. I think agents are extremely influential, especially in the modern NBA, over where players go and where they end up. But my whole thing with the Jalen Brunson thing that everyone loves to point to is, like, Jalen Brunson got paid the most money that he could basically make, except for if he went back to the Mavericks, and he was offered a role that he could not have on the Luka Doncic Dallas Mavericks, and they hired his dad as an assistant coach. And Jalen Brunson's great. What is he, like the 50th best player in the NBA? Yeah. Like, he's not Joel Embiid. Like, if there is, I would say, unless there's some other sort of move that's out there in terms of, unless there's some other kind of move in terms of they're able to get another star that actually can make a real impact. Joel Embiid finally, like, forcing a trade after they put the right pieces around him and get him a decent enough team would just be kind of absurd to me, because you're going to the New York Knicks, who do not have anything at this time, especially considering what they would probably have to give up in draft capital and in the players that they have currently on their team to land a player the caliber of Joel Embiid. They have nothing on their team left if you make that trade in order to contend for championships. So unless your goal is literally just, I want to win 50 games and win MVP and be in New York with my friends, my old agents, then I just don't really see any kind of logic behind that comment. But I actually was touching on the other theory that he has been pushing, which is that the reason why Joel Embiid is unhappy, or seems to be unhappy, after the Milwaukee game when he didn't take comments, was because he actually is upset because they're building around Harden instead of him, because they brought in all the old Houston guys. You know, Daryl's doing his old thing where he just brings back those guys who have played with Harden. It looks like it's Harden's team and it's not Joel's team, which, like, if you watch the first two games, it was basically a split 50-50. Joel just looked terrible and Harden looked great. So that would be a weird conclusion to take from the first two games. But I don't buy that. But if there is an inkling of that, if there is a slight chance, there's no way you can hire Mike D'Antoni unless Joel Embiid is the one that's telling you to hire Joel Embiid. Because
sure,
like, the history shows he got James Harden an MVP. They got to the conference finals. They were the greatest success that he's arguably ever had as a coach and as a player together. Plus you have all these other pieces. Plus you already have Daryl Morey as the GM. I think at a certain point I would understand if they were like, yeah, let's go with an internal hire over bringing in a guy who we already make the Rockets jokes all the time. Like, we probably have to draw the line somewhere, is my point.
Sure. And just going real quick back to New York, I don't think we're anywhere near a point. Joel Embiid has given no indication that that's even on his mind.
Sure.
I think he's committed to Philadelphia. He's been pretty consistent in that. He looks like right now he is a present-day Dame Lillard. That can, of course, always change at the drop of a dime. But so far, I think he has done a pretty good job of going through the ups and downs with the city of Philadelphia. And to your point about agents, I do think that is completely overstated. Look, I saw Joel Embiid interact with Leon Rose a lot because Leon Rose was based out of Philadelphia. He was at almost every home game. Did he go over and say hi to him? Yes. Did I see this incredible bond where Joel Embiid would go to a shitty situation because he loves Leon Rose that much? No, I didn't. It looked like it was, hey, bro, thanks for getting me millions of dollars. It was,
of course.
That kind of a relationship. So yeah, New York doesn't concern me in the slightest, yeah. But no, I agree. Like, if Joel Embiid is unhappy, the first step, and I think whatever Daryl does, I think he will keep Joel Embiid at the top of his mind. I think he understands this is Joel Embiid's team. I think he understands that keeping him happy is the most important thing he has right now to do as a general manager, which directly aligns with team goals, which is good because winning will help keep Joel Embiid happy. But, you know, he is not going to hire Mike D'Antoni if he thinks that's going to cause a friction. He's not going to prioritize James Harden over Joel Embiid. I have full confidence in that. I agree with you. The only way Mike D'Antoni could be a possibility is if Joel Embiid goes, yes, absolutely, that's the number one guy that I want.
And to be fair, last time around, if I remember correctly, when the candidates were the two guys I wanted, which were Ty Lue and Mike D'Antoni, Joel was concerned about the clutch connection with Ty Lue. There was at least that was the thought behind this, was that they might have been concerned with that, and that he preferred Mike D'Antoni, and that basically the compromise candidate was Doc Rivers, because he wasn't Joel's guy, he wasn't Ben's guy, he was the neutral candidate that they could bring in. And if that is the case, I think that Joel obviously has shown a fondness for D'Antoni in the past. It would be a little bit weird if they did decide to bring in D'Antoni, especially in the middle of the season, only because D'Antoni's whole thing has been like, we don't do we're not a post-up center league anymore. Like, you don't do that, basically. So it would be an interesting thing to see how he would use Joel Embiid and how he would make that fit between Harden and Embiid work, which offensively is certainly not an issue. It seems like those two, I think that they will figure it out, and over the course of the season, they'll end up being, once again, a very, very good offense. So
agreed on all fronts.
Anything else you want to add here before we wrap it up? Any any thoughts or your newsletter, which I read all the time, is great. The Daily Six, please subscribe. I'll put the link down there if you have not already. Anything else you want to include?
No, I just want to thank you for doing this early enough in the day that I can go watch a Phillies game. You're like,
Let's
hey,
go.
what's your availability? And I said, hey, I'm available up until 2 p.m. I did not say why 2 p.m. was a cutoff, but I appreciate you being accommodating, because now I can go and have hopefully something that brings me just a tiny bit of joy in Philadelphia sports. So thank you very much for that.
Well, look, everyone knows that I am not a baseball guy, but I have been enthralled by this Phillies run. It's really awesome. It's fun. Playoff baseball is a lot of fun. It's great to see everyone happy about a team again.
No, there's very few sports, maybe none, that have the wide discrepancy between meaningless baseball and playoff baseball, and the 100%. Excitement and the energy. Even last night, like I was leaving the Sixers game, and I just like walked to the front of the stadium, like walked to the gate, just to sort of like hear it. I didn't have a ticket. I was thinking about trying to like take my Sixers press pass and cover up the NBA portion, and just seeing like my photo and press and seeing if I could like trick my way in. Decided to go against that, but just hearing the roar of the stadium is incredible. The Phillies, I had a partial season ticket plan after graduating college. Like the one expenditure I made for myself was getting a partial season ticket plan. It just so happened I picked that up in 2006 and was there for that run.
Oh, awesome.
I was there actually right behind me. You can't see it because my wall's a mess, but there's a ticket to the Game 5 of the 2008 World Series.
Oh, amazing.
And it was sort of like my last, because I then covered my first real covering of the NBA was 2009 with the NBA draft. And it was like my last time as just like a pure fan without having sort of this whole media thing going on. And I was a little unsure whether or not I could still feel that way as a fan, because I've never covered the Phillies. In fact, The Athletic at one point asked me whether I'd be interested in writing about the Phillies, especially because we didn't hire a Phillies crew until a couple months after we launched and a couple months after the end of that season. And even other places like SB Nation and whatnot, and Philadelphia Magazine, they'd ask me like, hey, do you have any interest in covering Phillies? And I had a hard no, because I wanted one team that I could just still be a fan of.
Yes.
And I was a little bit uncertain, because having to cover sports just changes your perspective so much, especially when you are actually there as like a journalist and you have to get to know the people you cover and all that stuff. But I have learned during this run that yes, I can still be a fan, and I'm very, very happy about that. So
well, I'm glad. I am 100% on board with that. And I don't know if you saw the clip that was floating around Twitter, but who would listen to a fan podcast anyway? You know,
I did see that. I did.
So now we need you to have a Phillies podcast, is what I'm trying to say.
No, I'm not doing anything related to that team, because I just want to be able to watch it and react to it and have ridiculous hot takes that have no thought behind them, and I'm just reacting emotionally. Pretty much the opposite of what you tried to bring me on this podcast to do. Even though after that Spurs game, I don't know if I can completely react in the same manner anyway. But I want the Phillies. I want to keep that pure for sure.
I love it. I love it so much. Thank you so much, Bodner, for coming on again. Once again, I'll put all of the links in the description so you can follow him. I'm sure you already are. If you're not, please subscribe to the Daily Six newsletter. Peace, bud.
Yep, my pleasure.